Reliable service is our highest decarbonization priority. And what we mean by that is that we know that what our riders want is transportation that is reliable, frequent, on time, accessible, that gets them where they want to go. And so truly making our service more reliable is how we keep our existing riders excited about the service that they're getting and how we attract new riders to the system.
Welcome back to Spilling the Tea, the podcast where we go behind the scenes of the MBTA, and I'm your host, Andrew Cassidy. As the MBTA works to modernize its service and prepares for a changing climate, the topics of decarbonization and resilience have become front and center. To discuss how the MBTA is dealing with these things, I'm joined today by Eshel and Katherine Bean of the MBTA's Climate Policy and Planning team. Thank you both for joining us. This is a first for Spilling the Tea. We have two guests today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, we're excited to be a part of this groundbreaking new format for Spilling the Tea.
Excellent. Hopefully everything goes well. So I guess just to start, could you tell us a little bit about your current roles at the MBTA, maybe a little bit about your background in the field, just so our listeners kind of understand where you're coming from?
Sure. So I'll kick us off. For those who haven't met me, Eshel, I'm the Senior Director of Climate Policy and Planning here at the MBTA. I've been with the authority for about 2 years. Before that, I was with the City of Boston, actually, for about 6 years. Generally, my background's in environmental science and policy. I actually started in fisheries policy and took a long and winding road, pun intended, to get here into the transportation space, but oversee a team that works across climate policy, so thinking about internal standards and sort of what standards we set for ourselves as an authority, but then also long-range planning for climate.
Yeah, and that's where I come in, Katherine Bean. I'm the Director of Climate and Sustainability Planning, working on Kat's team. I'm also coming up on about 2 years at the T in June. Before this, I worked in local government out in Montana, working for Missoula County, also in the climate and environmental policy and planning space. Have spent most of my career in the public sector, working for nonprofits and local government. This is my first foray into transit, but when my family relocated to Boston, 2 years ago, it was just such a wonderful opportunity when the T creating this climate policy and planning team. Been a longtime transit nerd and transit lover. And so it was just a wonderful chance for me to get to connect personal interests with a new professional opportunity.
Excellent. Can you tell me a little bit about this team and kind of the department as a whole?
Yeah, so the Office of Climate Policy and Planning is a very new team. I was the first hire, so we were created about 2.5 years ago, and this was in sort of the early days of the Healey-Driscoll administration when Governor Healey had appointed a new climate chief, Chief Hoffer, and there was just this renewed energy in wanting to see an all-of-government approach to climate. And so we're actually anchored in a policy and strategic planning division within the MBTA, and there was already an office of strategic transit planning. And so in sort of renewing that engagement with the rest of the administration on climate, there was a need that emerged around needing to have a team with clear expertise in climate planning and being able to be the voice of the T in some of these climate spaces. And so we have this dual purpose, both looking at long-range climate planning. So what does it mean to make the T resilient? What does it mean to reduce our organizational emissions? What does it mean for the T to be a climate solution? So that's kind of looking on the carbon side. But then internally, we also really wanted to look at, well, what are the standards that we're setting for ourselves as an organization? What does it mean for us to be a sustainable organization? And what does that mean in terms of the types of facilities that we're constructing or how we're conducting our business? And then it's also being able to engage in external conversations with the rest of our partners in state government as they're developing new policies and regulations. How can we make sure that transit is part of that story and there are transit-specific considerations so that really we're set up to be able to do the work that we need to do as a transit agency, which is moving lots of people around the region in a very low-carbon way.
We're in the business of moving people, as Ryan Cahoon likes to say. So I guess I'd want to start with just a little bit of a definition of terms, just so everyone's on the same page. You know, I grew up with,
reduce, reuse, recycle.
Thank you. Reduce,
yes,
reuse.
The 3 R's.
The 3 R's.
Yes, of sustainability.
But decarbonization, resilience, those are a little bit newer to the lexicon for environmentalism. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means, even outside of the MBTA?
Yeah. So maybe I'll start with decarbonization if you
Go
want
for
to take
it.
resilience.
That sounds good.
So decarbonization, it's about removing carbon from the atmosphere. So when we talk about global warming, which is another term that people may have heard of, and climate change, this is a phenomenon that happens because through burning of fossil fuels, things like oil and gas and coal, we're releasing carbon particles into the atmosphere. That's resulting in the atmosphere not being able to reflect as much heat back out. And so we're actually trapping more heat inside our atmosphere, and it's deregulating some of our atmospheric dynamics, and it's making our climate hotter and our planet hotter. It just makes weather more unpredictable. It makes extremes more extreme. And it's resulting in things like ice caps melting at the poles and sea level rise. So when we talk about decarbonization, that means that at a societal level, we're trying to reduce how much carbon our energy use is releasing into the atmosphere. That doesn't mean that we have to fully eliminate all carbon emissions necessarily, because there is a certain amount of internal capacity at a planetary scale to absorb some carbon on an ongoing basis. And this is sort of the role of things like the Amazon rainforest. Our major forests and all plant matter absorb some carbon. Same thing, the oceans can absorb some carbon. And so it means that we just need to reduce significantly. So not just, we really do have to reduce significantly how much carbon we're releasing into the atmosphere. And that means that we have to change how we as a society use energy, whether it's in our buildings or how we get around, what we do with the waste that we produce. So if it's going to a landfill or if it's getting incinerated, as well as how all the goods and products that we use every day are manufactured. All of that, those are typically activities that today produce carbon. And so there's been a lot of transformation over the past couple decades to really change how we as a society are using energy and using different sources of energy. So using sources of energy like hydrogen or wind or solar or hydropower from dams or even things like nuclear. So sources of energy that don't rely on fossil fuels. So that's kind of decarbonization at a societal level.
That was
Awesome.
a very sweeping explanation. Well done. And I'm impressed by your ability to remember so much planetary science. I feel like it's been a long time since I've been in that space. And so whenever people can actually explain the process, I appreciate that.
Impressive.
Resilience is a term that actually came out in the 70s, and it is, in its essence, the ability to withstand disturbance without disruption, without being fully disrupted. And it can exist at the scale of an ecosystem, and so how well an ecosystem can experience changes in temperature or precipitation without fully changing. We can think about resilience within our communities and the ability to withstand a serious event without fundamentally changing as well. And then I spend a lot of time thinking about how our transit system can be resilient as well, which I know we'll get more into, but thinking about how we can prepare for extreme rain or changing temperatures without service disruptions.
And I guess now for the both of you, why is it important to understand these in terms of just even an operational perspective?
I think one place to start is that the T doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Yep.
We exist in space. And so we ourselves are also exposed to a lot of those same impacts of global warming. And so it means that we have to be able to adapt our system so that we're building the system not just for today, but also building a system that can endure and continue to serve our communities for decades to come. We're in this for the long haul, right? And so it's really needing to make sure that on a day-to-day basis, we're set up well so that our operators and folks who work on the track and who are just out there sort of making the system run every day are able to do so in safe environments and that we're able to provide reliable service for years and years to come, both today and tomorrow. We also need to confront this because we are part of an administration that has some really ambitious climate goals. Our legislature also has set some really ambitious goals. And so as a community, Massachusetts is really on the forefront of leading on climate change. And so that means as an agency, we're constantly thinking about, well, what is the service that we're offering today? How do we transform that and modernize it to better serve our communities and continue to get more people onto transit? But then how do we think as well about our organizational sustainability? There's an imperative there as well. And some of it is just best practice and common sense. How can we be even better at reusing materials? We're very thrifty here at the T. But also, how can we think about our own sources of energy? And there's always a connection as well between these two terms of decarbonization resilience, because when you think about your energy, you're also thinking about, well, how reliable is my energy source? Because you need to be able to operate even when things kind of get bad and when you can't get fuel deliveries. And so thinking about it from those different lenses is really important. And it's really just vital to the T being able to operate on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, the climate is changing, but people's desire to get places is not. And it's not going to change even as, storms become more intense or the conditions in which you're traveling change. So we need to make sure that the T is adapted for those new conditions and can still provide great, reliable service, even as the environment around us is altered.
So you've both mentioned that service, you've talked about the need for service. And I know the MBTA itself has said that reliable service is actually one of its priorities when it comes to decarbonization. But what does that actually mean? How does service and decarbonization interrelate?
Yeah. So when we look at this from an emissions standpoint, when you look at the state's total emissions, transportation is the largest source of emissions in Massachusetts.
And when you say transportation, you mean everybody.
I mean
all the cars,
everybody.
all the trucks,
everybody
all the buses,
driving,
Okay.
all the deliveries, all the freight, everything that is moving to get people and goods around in Massachusetts. And so in recent years, it's been about a third of emissions. Most recently, for the last sort of greenhouse gas inventory that the state took, it was about 38% of the state's emissions. So transportation is the biggest source of emissions in Massachusetts. But when you look at...
I was just going to add, and not just Massachusetts, but nationwide too. These are trends that transportation has a large footprint.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Yeah.
We're not unique in that respect.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And so when you look at how the MBTA tallies up to that and what our contribution is to those emissions, our emissions are actually equivalent to about just 1% of that 38%. So
we punch above our weight, big time.
Truly, because the kicker is that then if you look at how people are getting around, we serve about 1 in 10 commuter trips in the greater Boston region. So the statistics, there's a little bit of apples to oranges here, but I think the takeaway is that by and large, we're a very small portion of those emissions, but we are a disproportionate amount of the travel that is happening. So as Caroline put it, we're punching above our weight. And that means that reliable service is our highest decarbonization priority. And what we mean by that is that we know that what our riders want is transportation that is reliable, frequent, on time, accessible, that gets them where they want to go. And so truly making our service more reliable is how we keep our existing riders excited about the service that they're getting and how we attract new riders to the system. And if we think about transit as being critical to mode shift, then reliable service is our biggest priority. And maybe a term definition there for mode shift.
Let's do it.
So mode shift is broadly when you are changing the way that somebody is getting around. So a lot of folks in Massachusetts are getting around in single occupancy vehicles. They're driving alone. And so mode shift is when they're shifting away from that mode or any other mode and going towards something else. And we really want to see more people going from driving alone to ideally riding in transit, but there are lots of other ways that they can get around, like biking and walking or carpooling.
Totally. And there's been some interesting studies, too, that have shown that looking at bus transportation, for example, regardless of what fuel the bus is running on, so whether it's diesel, hybrid, running on gasoline, or an electric bus, that if you are able to put a full bus running on the road versus those same 40 people or so driving a car, regardless of the fuel type of the bus, it is a cleaner, lower carbon option.
By far.
By far.
Again, the importance of pushing people to public transportation.
It's huge.
And the cascading impacts that it has, kind of 1% of emissions, 10% of trips, basically. Mm-hmm. And, even as you look at traffic and, the amount of time people are now spent idling in their cars versus actually just driving, unencumbered to and from somewhere, you're just burning more and more fuel. And I know the MBTA has also, talked about how it's going to be playing an integral role in helping Massachusetts meet its goals. So what is the MBTA's role in all of that?
Well, part of our role is just that reliable service, but then it's all the work that we're doing to modernize our modes and improve that service. So you were just talking about, people getting stuck in traffic. Buses get stuck in traffic too. So all the work that's happening and being led by our teams in operations working on bus transformation and bus modernization to do more rapid bus sort of lanes. So those red, those red carpets that we roll out for bus. Exactly.
I love that.
I love the red carpet for bus. But that is a huge part of how we make sure that all those riders that could have otherwise been in a car are able to move smoothly through traffic and expeditiously. And that's why we're so excited as well about automated camera enforcement coming into play so that we can really deliver the promise of those rapid bus lanes. It's also all the work that we're doing on things like the track improvement program. That was a sort of generational investment that we made to eliminate slow zones. And we're giving so much time back to riders. And we never framed it as a climate investment, but it was a climate investment because it means that a service that people found sometimes found so frustrating on a day-to-day basis that sometimes they shifted a mode away from transit and they chose to find a different way to get to work or get to their doctor's appointments. They might have taken an Uber to get to that appointment instead of taking the train. They're now able to show up at a T-stop and know that they're going to be able to have a ride within a certain amount of time and that it's going to get there faster. I feel like there were so many anecdotes when we had just finished the track improvement program about people missing their stop because they were sort of reading something and then looked up and they were like, oh no, the train's going so much faster than it used to. It happened to me. It was sad. But I was also very happy about it because really it just shows that we've been making so many investments into the system and improving it. And that's sort of what attracts people back. All of that work to modernize the mode. So whether it be everything that's happening with bus network redesign and the Better Bus Project, everything that's been happening to modernize the rapid transit lines, the new ferry routes that we're adding. I feel like we buy a boat every other month. And some upcoming work to really modernize the regional rail system because we're moving from commuter rail to regional rail.
Love it.
All of that work is how the T can really lead on climate in Massachusetts.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've touched on so many different efforts that have already happened or are in the pipeline at the T. And it speaks to the fact that the entire organization is a climate solution, as you were saying. We are a small team. We're just 3 people. We work really closely with another team in environment, which is about 5 people. The 8 of us cannot dramatically improve the decarbonization and resiliency outcomes of the T by ourselves. We work hand in hand with all sorts of teams across the agency, and that is really what enables the T to be a part of the climate solution on both the decarbonization and the resiliency front.
Yeah. And generally, I think the state really has embraced this vision of the T as a climate solution. The way that the state sort of plans around climate, it's a document called the Clean Energy and Climate Plan. They're gearing up to update it again. They update it every 5 years. But in the last one, bus modernization was a key strategy that was named as one of the ways that the transportation sector was going to decarbonize. It identified the importance of these bus rapid transit corridors, of sort of changing our fleet mix and going towards cleaner vehicles. And so there really is this recognition that transit and getting more people onto transit is how we decarbonize and how we achieve our collective climate goals. And this doesn't just have a benefit from a climate standpoint. It also has huge other benefits in terms of air quality, and even just like
quality of life.
Yes, exactly. Social resilience, being able to keep people together and sort of knit communities together. If it's easier to go visit grandma, you're going to go visit her more often.
Exactly. Well, I mean, there's an interesting interrelation with transit. And as someone who was not originally in the transit world, over time, you start seeing all of the different ways that transportation, and particularly public transportation, has just a multitude of impacts. So, our previous episode, we had Reggie Ramos from
Great
Transportation.
Episode.
Thank you. From Massachusetts. And we were talking about social justice. And again, that plays into the health factor, plays into the environmental factor. And it's all positive things. It's, it's like, you pick the positive that you're going to champion. There's just so many great things happening. So I guess where does decarbonization stand right now with the MBTA? Because we've talked about bus electrification, rail modernization, even just power infrastructure. Where are we in the path forward? And how do we take this from being something on a page to being something that's implemented out there in the real world?
Yeah, so when we look at our own sort of direct organizational emissions, we've made a lot of progress. So we've been sort of calculating how many greenhouse gases we emit every year based on the fuel that we use and the energy that we use to power the system, going back to 2008. And since then, we've cut our direct emissions, so how much energy we're using and sort of what emissions they represent, by about 25%. The state has a sort of statewide target for the transportation sector to cut those emissions by 25% by 2030. So it's 2026. We're ahead of schedule.
Nice.
So there's a lot that we have done, and some of that is just the modernization of the technology. So one of the big shifts, for example, that we've done over the years is that we've shifted from diesel buses to diesel electric hybrid buses. The fuel economy on those is huge, and full credit to vehicle engineering and all the folks that have led the way and making that shift and adopting that new vehicle type. It improves our mileage by about 55%. And that means that we cut the emissions from buses by about a third. A little over a third. And so that's just shifting from diesel to hybrids. And then we're also obviously moving towards some battery electric buses. We have 11 that are in service already in limited service. We have 27 delivered. We're going up to 120 that will be delivered over the next year or so, and are hugely excited about that change, and are seeing good results there as well. It's also even just the modernization of the rail vehicles too. The orange line and green line and red line cars that we're getting delivered now, those are also generating a lot of energy, but through regenerative braking. So when they break, they sort of are able to reuse that energy and sort of take it back, and then it helps use less energy when they have to accelerate again. And so we're actually seeing like a pretty significant reduction in how much electricity we're using to power the subway because of that adoption of a new modern technology. So there's just a lot of ways in which transit as an industry is shifting its technology and growing over time to be more energy efficient. As just a matter, of course, that's almost a type of financial sustainability, even more so than sort of environmental sustainability, but it's having some really good co-benefits, which is great to see.
Yeah, absolutely.
So shifting gears now over into resiliency, the phrase resiliency is reliability is kind of become a rallying cry. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So we think about resiliency as I was saying earlier, the ability to withstand some sort of disturbance or extreme event. And that means that in the context of the MBTA, that even when it's snowing really hard or raining hard, or there might be some sort of coastal flooding, that the train or the bus can still pick you up in a reliable way on time and get you to where you're going when you need to be there. So we think about all of those investments that make the train more reliable are also resiliency investments too, because as we're doing state of good repair projects, we're also increasing the resiliency of our system as well. When we make sure that our assets are working appropriately and are able to clear snow off the tracks more efficiently, for example, it means that our trains are able to move through those events more easily and still get our riders where they need to go, and that they can count on us. So yes, we talk about resiliency as reliability. It's kind of the concrete way that all these resiliency investments show up. If it's really working well, you're not even noticing that there are these kind of climate disruptions potentially impacting your transit trip because the system is just running as it should through those events.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting because I think there are going to be some events where occasionally the way that we make the system more resilient is by shutting some parts of the system down while the weather event is happening, so that we're preventing sort of catastrophic damage, so that when the waters recede, we can take barriers down and open things back up, no damage. We can restore service really quickly.
Right. And that's the other part of the reliability too, is that, okay, there might be that temporary disruption, as you were saying, but we can bounce back really quickly. We can open without weeks of expensive repairs that are time consuming and potentially prone to delay. We're just able to predict it, put a system in place, and then open up when it's time and safe to travel again.
And examples of that would be something like the Fenway portal, as well as aquarium station.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think the aquarium floodplains people are getting more and more accustomed to. We participate in the City of Boston's Deployable Day each fall, which is an event with private and public infrastructure where we will test out our deployable barriers to kind of have a learning event of sort of how these barriers work and how they can prevent flooding from occurring now and into the future. So we have these silver metal flood planks in front of Aquarium Station, which again, we put out in September as sort of a test event, but they're ready in the case of a forecasted storm. And they've been tremendously helpful in reducing potential damage that could come in through Aquarium Station. People might be familiar with Winter Storm Grayson in 2018, where Aquarium Station was completely inundated with coastal flooding. It caused serious economic damage, I think just over $3 million in repairs, and they were also time-consuming to do. And now that we have those floodplains in place, we're able to protect the station from similar events and be up and running as quickly as possible. So people, when the barriers are deployed, they might experience not being able to enter Aquarium Station. The station is closed, but we're still able to open it back up once the threat has passed.
And still being running Blue Line service in the interim. So you just have to, go down a stop, but you're still able to get where you need to go.
Exactly. If they're able to get up to State Street a couple blocks up, then they're still able to access the Blue Line in that area.
Excellent. So what are the biggest climate threats right now that the MBTA is facing, and what do those vulnerabilities look like for the MBTA?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's 5 climate hazards that we face. Talked a little bit about coastal flooding, and which can come from sea level rise, and is already occurring with sort of where we are in relationship to the ocean. We also experience flooding damages from extreme precipitation. So extreme rainfall events. A couple years ago out in Leominster, we had so much rainfall in 24 hours that it actually washed out a culvert on the commuter rail and took out a lot of commuter rail infrastructure. We also are facing threats from extreme temperatures on both the cold and the hot side. So I think we are at the T very accustomed to cold weather, sort of the traumatic experience of the 2015 winter with several delays, which then led to several operational changes for snow and ice, which have been great. But an emergent threat is more on heat. And so that's definitely on our mind as we enter the summer season and thinking about how heat can impact our infrastructure. So for example, that might lead to slow zones when the temperatures are above 95 degrees or so, where we need to be careful for potential rail buckling or kinking, which is essentially like little curves in the track that can happen. So you might experience slower speeds on those days. There's been a couple of news stories about Amtrak having to do that in summers past. It can also impact our signals and communications equipment on the right of way. Essentially, a lot of our signals and communications is a lot of very high-tech computers running in a small area, so they can be prone to overheating if it's too hot outside.
In a little metal box.
Yes, in a little metal box that's exposed, which we are also working on as a resiliency strategy as well. And then we also have threats from wind as well, which is often accompanying any one of those other hazards that I mentioned, but that can lead to trees falling over into the right-of-way, taking down overhead catenary, for example, which actually relates to some of our decarbonization strategies too, as we think about electrifying service and how we can make sure that we are moving forward on our decarbonization goals without sacrificing potential resiliency concerns and benefits.
Yeah, I think another flavor of that is same thing, having catenary in a floodplain when there's coastal sea level rise. Is that a great idea? Well, I think there's a lot of tension between resilience and decarbonization sometimes. I was actually recalling, as you were talking about 2015 and snowpocalypse, that storm really was a wake-up call for the MBTA and really was some of what triggered a lot of the research that's happened over the past years. And it's worth sort of telling the story that back in the day, we were really good. Like the red line was crippled for, I think, well over a month. Whereas this past winter, we had some pretty major storms. We were back up and running pretty quickly. And so it's worth showing and telling the story that operationally, we have really improved our response to some of these extreme events, and are able to and have invested in the infrastructure necessary in order to be able to respond quickly and bounce back and restore service faster. So it shows that, a decade later, we're in a much better place than we were.
Speaking of intersections now, we've established decarbonization, we've established resiliency. What does that overlap look like?
So I think where I would start is that it's the energy and it's how we power our system, right? Energy is at the core of how we get around. If we don't have reliable sources of electricity, if we don't have reliable sources of other fuels, then we can't power the system. And then there is no service. And then there's sort of a breakdown in just that mobility function and how people get around. And so that's why, as you think about changing the sources of your power, you also need to think about the reliability of that power. That's, I think, the first key piece there.
And I mean, earlier you spoke quite a bit about how our number one decarbonization strategy as a Commonwealth is to move more people onto transit. And I would argue that, and I think you did as well, that we can't, encourage that type of mode shift without offering reliable service too. And so all of these resiliency investments where people can know that they can trust our system to operate also kind of, act as positive feedback loops with these broader decarbonization goals as well. So I see them in that sense working completely in tandem with one another.
Makes a lot of sense. And then I guess going backwards a little bit, how does that play into your resiliency roadmap and kind of the amalgamation of different pieces that are involved in that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think also stemming from 2015, which was a bit of a wake-up call for us to do some really serious planning and research about what our climate hazards are and how those manifest as vulnerabilities across our system. We, after 2015, kicked off a lot of that research. And I want to give a lot of credit to one of our colleagues in the environmental department, Hannah Lyons-Galante, who spearheaded a tremendous amount of that research. So far, we as the T have completed about 25 climate change vulnerability assessments and studies. Each of those studies can be several hundred pages long, which I think, left an opportunity for us to really identify the path forward from all of that data and move from a place of study to a place of action. And so that has led to the Resilience Roadmap, which is a plan that will be coming out at the end of April. It's been the culmination of about a year of dedicated work, planning work, but of course building on the shoulders of all of that other research I was mentioning. And the Resilience Roadmap is just that. It's a roadmap for how we're going to build resilience for the T as our climate is changing. And it identifies 9 key focus areas: power, as Kat was mentioning, increasing the resiliency of our power system, reducing the risk of flooding within our tunnel system, which is a really key vulnerability for our infrastructure, which I didn't touch on earlier. But essentially, if water comes in through one of the parts of our tunnel system, for instance, out by Airport Portal, which is near the station, that water can inundate across the central tunnel system. And so you might think, there's just going to be these localized impacts here, but it spreads all throughout the system and can create these cascading impacts where it's not just the Blue Line riders who are going to be impacted. It can spread throughout the T. We're also thinking really carefully about how to protect our employees from extreme heat. That's an increasing concern. So thinking about training, PPE for heat, and making sure that our employees have rest, breaks and water available to them while they're out working on the tracks and in exposed conditions. And then we're also, I'll just add one more thing, and if people can go read the plan to see through all 9 strategies. But really also investing in collaborating with regional partners too. We want to be a part of a robust transportation system and a robust resiliency solution as well. We don't want to just protect our own infrastructure. We want to be a part of these broader conversations to build resiliency in the communities that we serve as well. So that's another key focus area of the plan.
Yeah, we're lucky here in Massachusetts that there is so much activity on climate planning and resilience planning in particular. There's tremendous leadership from the Healy-Driscoll administration, who released Resilient Coasts recently, which is a plan sort of looking across the entirety of Massachusetts coastline as to how we can make those various regions more resilient collectively, and thinking about sort of regional scale and district scale solutions. But there's also a tremendous amount of planning that's happening at the local level in cities like Boston and Cambridge, but as far north as Manchester by the Sea, and really just across the coastline. And so very often, without any information out there that's really sort of accessible and digestible, a lot of those municipalities sometimes have made assumptions about how they think the T might play into their own resilience plans. And so we're hoping that this plan makes us less of a black box and more of a partner, so that folks can understand where our own resilience priorities are, and so that we can start identifying where those win-win situations are, how we can work collectively together to protect not just our system, but also the communities around us. If we build a rampart, a fortress around the system, but the communities around us have to move away, well, we've lost the public and public transit. We are nothing without the communities that we serve.
And I think this will also serve to make that partnership more accessible, and that people will want to come in, be partners, and understand, again, we're not just a giant T floating amorphously out in space, but rather we are a part of the community just like they are. That's excellent. So we have a lot of documentation. How do we take climate and make it work in operational terms? What is that relationship looking like?
In the resiliency area of our work, I would say operations is a huge component of it, because as we can do the best planning in the world, we can invest in an aggressive way in resilient infrastructure, and climate impacts are still going to happen. The rail might still buckle when it's extremely cold. A signals box that's a metal box on the side of the right-of-way might still overheat. And so we need to make sure that our operational capacity to respond to those potential disruptions and address them as quickly as possible is a really robust part of our operations. Rail buckling is kind of part of the business in some capacity. That's what we hear from other transit agencies working in the South, for example, with extreme heat. So how can we make sure that our maintenance of way division has all of the staffing and equipment resources that they need to respond to that incident as quickly as possible is a huge priority. And we're also thinking about operational efficiencies too. So for example, with those deployable flood barriers at Aquarium Station, if we're going to use more deployables at other parts of the system, we have to think about all of the operational dominoes that come with that as well, to make sure we have enough personnel to be out there and installing them, knowing that a storm is probably coming. And so how do we balance, protecting our system with also kind of the operational efficiencies of getting a lot of people, employees, where they need to be in a timely manner before the storm hits? So there's some of that operational planning as well.
It's funny because I think a lot of what is operational resilience or decarbonization, some of it is best practice and codifying what's already happening, or just reframing it as, no, this is a climate action. I'm thinking about sort of the example of drainage on the Southwest Corridor, which is an area where sometimes we can get a lot of rainfall. For those who don't know, Southwest Corridor is on the Orange Line, kind of in the Jamaica Plain Roxbury area. And if we have a heavy storm, rainwater can pool, and there's sort of good practice that you can do ahead of a storm where you go and you clear your catch basins. You make sure that there's no vegetation. The same way that on your street, you might look at a storm drain and move some vegetation there because you're a good Samaritan. But that's one example. But if I think more broadly, a lot of this is people just continuing to show up and do their job every day. A bus driver who's helping get a bunch of people safely from point A to point B, that's them being a climate leader.
And bus drivers make a ton of decisions kind of on the fly when there's a lot of snow, for example, blocking a bus stop, or rain is kind of pooling in a way where people can't get on and off the bus easily. So they're actually, making a ton of those decisions for passengers kind of in the moment, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. And then some of it's also just thinking about the amenities that are available to our employees. So there's a whole initiative about thinking about bathroom access for employees. If we think about extreme heat, you need to stay hydrated.
Yep.
And so we hear that sometimes bus drivers will say, oh, after a certain point, I stop drinking water because I know that I can't get to a bathroom until I get to this point way far down my line. And so that's a huge problem because basically it means that they don't feel they don't feel like they have the right conditions yet to be able to drink water as they need to and really stay hydrated. And so by thinking about where we can partner with municipalities and how we can deploy more bathrooms as we're going through bus network redesign, that's a form of climate resilience as well. It's just having better amenities for our employees.
Makes a lot of sense. And again, things you don't really think of, they don't come to mind. And I this is why I've really, I'm ecstatic to have the two of you on, because you don't get to understand that. There is the battery electric bus and the more low hanging fruit, having our own wind turbine. But understanding that granularity and that, the series of dominoes, as you said, how one thing affects the other, how a bathroom determines whether or not a bus operator can do his or her job to allow 40 people to get off the road so that those cars are off the road. It keeps going and going and going. And no one started to think about the bathroom as ground zero. Absolutely fascinating. So just to kind of tie things up, we're in a good place. We're in great hands. But what does 5 years look like? So let's do 5 years decarbonization, 5 years resilience.
I think in 5 years, where I see a lot of opportunity and where we're really excited to engage with folks over the next year is around thinking about how we can transform our regional rail system, and having made some real progress in that direction. So when we say moving from commuter rail to regional rail, we want to have a system on our regional that sort of spans regionally and that serves more rides than just your typical work rides, not just commutes. It's around serving people and a variety of rides at all times of day, having more frequency. So it's investing in frequency, reliability, accessibility, as well as decarbonization. And so we announced a few months ago that we're developing a rail modernization plan that will really sort of lay out a vision as to what we mean by regional rail and what it takes to deliver that. I think what I would love to see is that we have the funding that we need in order to do that scale of transformation. I think there's so much potential because about 3/4 of Massachusetts population lives within 3 miles of a commuter rail station. Sorry. Regional rail station. There you go. And there's just a huge number of people who could be riding the system, but they aren't for whatever reason. It isn't convenient to them. The train doesn't come as often as they would like it to. And so there's just huge potential here to grow the ridership and fulfill that promise of mode shift. And so it also takes really significant investments. We inherited a rail system that is the legacy of freight companies. There's a lot of areas where we only have one track. So it means one train in, one train out. You can't run as much service in that case. We have a lot of stations where we only have a platform on one side. So you can only alight one group of people at a time. And if that train is at the station, no train's getting past it. And so there's just a lot of infrastructure there where we have to think about our track geometry. We also have to think about grade crossings. If you're increasing frequency, then you might be increasing the number of times that the barriers are going down in front of a road, and you might be increasing disruption to the local community. And so there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be delivered from just the geometry of the track system. But then when you think about decarbonization, there's a lot of new technology out there. And so we're tremendously excited to be procuring 10 battery electric locomotives that will allow us to electrify along the Providence line and run service all the way through to Wickford Junction, because the Providence line doesn't actually stop in Providence. It keeps going to Wickford Junction. And we don't have catenary the whole way. And so having battery electric electric means that we'll be able to run on the catenary up to Providence, and then we'll be able to run on battery when we get all the way through to Wickford Junction and be able to fully electrify the whole line. The challenge then is around going further than the Fairmount line, where we're already working on electrification, and the Providence line, because you need significant power infrastructure. And because of the types of vehicles, the power infrastructure is on a scale. It's at a voltage that is very high. It's transmission level is what we call it, rather than distribution level is what serves a lot of people's homes and offices. It's at a lower voltage already, whereas because of the types of trains and the type of power needs that they have, it's a high voltage transmission system that you have to hook into. And that's something that's governed at the regional level. It takes very specific types of permitting processes, and it takes about 7 to 10 years typically for new transmission interconnection projects to happen. And this is just a space that the T hasn't built this kind of infrastructure in a very long time. The reason why we can do it faster on the south side along the sort of Fairmount and Providence lines is because Amtrak is already there and they've already electrified. They have the Northeast Corridor, that's Acela and Northeast Regional, that's already running on electricity. And so we actually share that infrastructure already. And so we're able to leverage that infrastructure. But at some point, it gets tapped. We're going to reach capacity on that existing infrastructure. And to be able to go further, we're going to have to build more transmission infrastructure. On the north side, we don't have a basis of infrastructure. There's nothing there yet. That's because even though Amtrak runs on the north side, it's running the Downeaster, which sort of is co-located with like the Haverhill and the Lowell lines. And so there really is no basis of infrastructure there, and we have to start from scratch. If folks pay attention, it's really hard to get energy projects going. And so there's a lot of innovation happening in Massachusetts, particularly looking at projects at the distribution level. But because transmission is sort of regionally governed, it's a different ballgame, essentially. And so where I really hope that we are in 5 years is that we have all the tools and all the funding support that we need to sort of play in this new league in order to be able to deliver that kind of infrastructure, and that we're well along the road to deliver our first set of transmission projects so that we can electrify more of the system and decarbonize more of the system. We don't think that we're going to be able to just run catenary everywhere. That's because, again, we inherited a really old legacy system. And there's a lot of stretches along the commuter rail where we run through wetlands and coastal floodplain, where maybe we don't want to build power infrastructure because we know of those climate hazards. So there's a resilience reason there. Do we want to increase our exposure to those climate hazards? Maybe not. Maybe that's not a good place to build catenary. Those are also typically sensitive environmental areas. And so from an environmental permitting standpoint, they just might not be workable. And then on the flip side, we have a lot of really old roads and bridges that we just don't have the vertical clearance necessary to have both the catenary and to have our double-decker commuter rail coaches. And so that means that you would have to sacrifice how many passengers you can serve in a train, because you would have to go back to single-level coaches in order to be able to. So there's a trade-off there, right? And so as we think about decarbonizing the regional rail system, there's going to be different types of electrified technologies that work for different parts of the system. We're doing battery electric locomotives for the Providence line because that's really a drop-in solution for us now. And so we're really excited about that opportunity to deliver that incremental bit of decarbonization sooner. But then as we look across the system and we go line by line, what type of technology it's going to be is going to vary based on the constraints of the system. How many sensitive environmental areas are we running through? How many of those low-hanging bridges do we have? How many grade crossings do we have? How many interlockings do we need to replace? How many stations do we need to upgrade? And so trying to sort of put all those puzzle pieces together so that we can get to the level of frequency that we really want to get to and that we have a vision for, which is getting to sort of around 30-minute frequency everywhere. Some areas will be able to go even more frequent. Some areas, maybe the ridership isn't there yet, and maybe it doesn't make sense for us to go. So maybe it'll be closer to 45 minutes, or we don't see a pathway to be able to deliver that infrastructure without major enabling projects. Eventually, you really do hit system capacity limits where you would have to sort of massively expand South Station, or you would have to create a second bore in Salem to have a second tunnel running. And so those are mega projects. We already have a mega project underway, the renovation of North Station Draw 1. That's a huge, huge project that's so critical. And there's some groundwork being laid in that project to enable that future system electrification, and sort of like thinking about what some of the substation needs might be there. But I think generally the party message is, I want us to be set up. I want us to be on the road for some of those transmission projects. I want us to have dedicated funding to be able to fund this, because it is a generational investment, but it's worth it because we can see the ridership and we can see the potential. And this is how the T can really grow its mode shift function, in addition to the critical role that's already being played by subway and bus.
Definitely an exciting time at the MBTA.
For sure.
And as far as resiliency?
On the resiliency side, that was a very detailed vision of decarbonization, which
you could tell that was her vision.
She was about it a lot.
I love it. I love it.
It shows.
Yeah. Maybe I'll offer some higher level comments for resilience. Okay, 5 years, that puts us in 2031. I would say within 5 years, we need to be addressing some of our key flood pathways, which we already have. You know, we mentioned some marquee projects that are in place, the Fenway Tunnel Portal, which protects from flooding from the Muddy River, the aquarium flood planks. But there are some other ways that water can get into our system by airport station, at the airport portal, around Community College, Sullivan Square, at some of our key maintenance facilities as well, which I think is something that maybe our riders aren't necessarily thinking about, because you're not interacting with the maintenance facility. I also didn't think about it much until I came to the T. But some of those facilities are just so critical to us being able to run service. And so we need to make sure that we can keep those operational and safe from sea level rise and coastal storms. So beginning to address some of those issues within the next 5 years is really key for us, especially thinking about airport portal, because that flooding can come in through the entire central tunnel system and create those cascading impacts that we spoke about. And then I would say outside of the physical infrastructure realm, I think one thing I hope for in the next 5 years is that we begin to unlock collective capacity, both internally and externally. So you mentioned how you might not think bathrooms is going to relate to getting more people off the road because of how it relates to reliable service and resiliency and all of these things. I think as an agency, we are also learning just kind of how robust all these interconnections are between the various departments and teams. And so continuing to strengthen those relationships, continuing to invest in cross-functional work, which I think our leadership has really emphasized and has been a wonderful thing for us all to focus on. It's such a collaborative time at the T. And so I think continuing to move forward in that direction, so that every employee of the T feels like they are a part of a climate solution in some way, will be really key. And then I think similarly on that capacity side, when we do think regionally and across the Commonwealth, I think there is a tremendous opportunity for us to innovate new ways of building climate resilience across broader scales. I think a lot of that is yet to be written nationally, internationally, but I feel really confident in the folks within this region, the various institutions and partners, the leadership from the state, that we will figure something out, something really interesting that can lead the rest of the country towards broader scale resilience. The more time I spend in this work, the more time I realize that none of us can go it alone. And so unlocking those partnerships, figuring out new ways to deliver our work, deliver infrastructure projects, even just think about how we deliver these projects is something I really want to see transform over the next 5 years.
What do you think is something that might be either misunderstood or oversimplified in your work, and what it takes to actually get things done that you'd like to share?
I think a lot about the chain reactions that occur before a customer realizes that service has been impacted. And I think that that's one thing that I'm hoping the Resilience Roadmap helps communicate, is sort of this order of criticality and priority of kind of how the dominoes go. For example, Kat talked about the power system and how that's key for our decarbonization strategy. It's also key to our resiliency strategy. We need to be able to protect the power system, whether that's our substations, our catenary, our third rail, so that we can continue to deliver service. If we can't protect the power system, it doesn't matter if your station has flooded because the train has never gotten there. So thinking about how those impacts kind of stack onto each other is really key. And then I think similarly, thinking about those support facilities and sort of how critical they are to service. Again, a rider is not seeing that, but it is absolutely fundamental for how we deliver service. And so just thinking about how what you see each day that you're using the system, of course, needs to be resilient, but its resilience depends on all of these things upstream.
Yeah, I feel like we spend so much time thinking about maintenance facilities and layover yards and pump rooms that are just buried deep in the tunnels that are dewatering and removing water from the tracks. We spend so much time thinking about pump rooms. Of course, you're never going to see one of those because
something has gone horribly wrong if you are. Yes.
Truly. And there's just so much hidden infrastructure, and truly for any sort of like nerd who likes to see how things are made, it's been so, I think, exciting and interesting for us to learn about for the past 2 years and sort of see all the ways in which there are so many people doing great work to address some of the state of good repair needs of the system and really get us back up to speed. So a lot of that resonated. I think on my end, I think one of the things that people don't see or experience is truly just how much better the buses of today are compared to the buses of yesterday, particularly from an air pollution standpoint. There's a lot of emphasis on battery electric being really zero emission. There's zero tailpipe emissions. They don't eliminate all air pollution because they still generate what's called particulate matter, and that's through the tire and the brake wear. So definitely eliminating tailpipe pollution. That being said, our hybrid buses and even our current diesel buses emit way less than the buses of 20 years ago. There's been a huge amount of progress in terms of improved emission standards for buses over the years. And so our hybrid buses meet what's called EPA Tier 4 standards, and it's like 90% less polluting than they would have been 20 years ago. So even though I think folks see a bus go by, they hear the diesel engine and they think, oh, pollution, it's so much cleaner than it used to be. And so there is such huge value in terms of renewing the fleet and continuing to replace and phase out older vehicles and continuing to invest in the reliability of the fleet. And so we did receive a federal award recently for $79 million from the U.S. Department of Transportation's Low-No Bus Grants for diesel electric hybrid buses. And that's going to allow us to phase out some of the oldest diesel buses. And so even though it's still a technology that's relying on fossil fuels partially, the technology itself has really, really improved. Same thing when we buy new diesel locomotives to phase out the oldest diesel locomotives. We're going same thing from a tier 0 to a tier 4. They're light years apart from each other in terms of the emissions that come out of those vehicles. And that also has benefits from a noise standpoint as well, which I know is something that a lot of folks really struggle with, particularly folks who live close to layover yards or near tracks. And so we're hoping that as we just modernize the fleet, even if it's like for like technology, there's an emissions benefit, there's also a quality of life benefit. And then if we need to, we can keep sort of thinking about the fuel types and shifting from sort of what we already have, which is ultra low sulfur diesel, to testing technologies and fuel types like renewable diesel, which basically is vegetable oil. So then you can make the joke that the tea runs on Dunkin'. We're not quite there yet, but we'll get there one day. But that's something that we've piloted on the commuter rail side, regional rail, in order to just see if the supply chain worked. It's a fuel type that hasn't really been available on the East Coast, but we had a fuel supplier reach out and say that they could bring it in by rail, actually. You'll love to see it. And it was at a time where sort of there was a bit of cost parity there. So being able to test out a fuel that is much cleaner from an emissions standpoint, from a carbon, but also an air pollution standpoint. So thinking about all emissions. But there's, I think just, being able to tell the story of how much better our bus fleet is today compared to what it was yesterday, and the improvements that we think we can really see on the regional rail fleet as well in terms of replacing those locomotives.
It's great to see that there's so much already in progress. As you said, things take time, whether it be installing catenary, ordering new buses, piloting vegetable oil as fuel, what have you. It does take time, but these aren't words on a paper.
Mm-hmm.
Those words are very important. But it's great to see these ideas be translated from words into action, and that we have a right now step, which is already light years ahead of where we were, but there's also a plan for the future that takes us even further. So that's absolutely phenomenal to hear.
Yeah, and over the next year, we're going to be developing a decarbonization plan. So really trying to sort of look across our modes and tell the story of what is the current impact of the system today in terms of all the carbon that we're helping the region avoid through that sort of function of public transit and the ridership that we already have, and potentially even trying to look at, well, what could that look like in the future if we were able to really grow our ridership? But then also looking at, well, what does it mean for the T to reduce its organizational emissions? There's a tension there because if we really increase our levels of service and really grow our service, that could increase our direct emissions, but that's a good thing because it means more people are riding the system. And so what does it mean to set a target for transit in terms of our organizational emissions while making sure that we're really holding true to our ultimate goal, which is to move as many people as possible on transit?
Yeah, and in a sense, if our organizational emissions grow, I kind of think about it's like, okay, we're a lever for creating this broader change in transportation emissions across the Commonwealth. The lever might be getting a little bigger, a little chunkier with our own emissions, but it means that we can exert a lot more force and have a more of an outsized impact on this big problem of transportation emissions, as well as all of the follow-on impacts that we've also talked about.
Well, it seems like the MBTA is definitely part of the climate solution for Massachusetts.
I'd like to think so.
Caroline, Kat, thank you both so much for taking the time to speak with us. Keep doing the amazing work that you're doing, and happy Earth Month.
Yes.
Happy Earth Month to one and all.
Yes, thanks for having us, and thanks for helping us get the word out.
Of course. And that concludes another episode of Spilling the Tea. I want to thank Kat Eshel and Caroline Bean for taking the time to speak with us today and share a little bit about what's going on the climate policy and planning team at the MBTA. I also want to thank you, our listeners, for tuning in. Your feedback means so much to us. If you have ideas or feedback for future episodes, please shoot us an email at social@mbta.com. I also want to thank the Menino Convention and Exhibition Center for hosting us in their facilities today. Until next time, I'm Andrew Cassidy, and this has been Spilling the Tea.